The Civil War really put everything on hold for the United States and most certainly for the southern states. And before the Civil War, people had started moving west. And after the Civil War, this picked up in earnest. So newspapers were an important part of this movement west. People who were immigrating across the country really wanted information from back east. They had relatives still there. This is very important, this second item here. They believed that the area they were going to was well established if it had a newspaper. For the Spanish language population and also those Native American populations, they wanted newspapers in their own language. And also, people needed something to read to entertain them in their very difficult lives because there was nothing about moving west that was easy. American Indians entered journalism in 1828. Shortly after the Cherokee language was written down, they started a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. And then in 1835, the Shawnee Sun was started out in the Indian Territory out west. But the Indians got no respect from the white press at all. A lot of editors considered Indians inferior. There is a typo in my PowerPoint here. I have just noticed that should be most frontier editors considered Indians inferior beings, not Indiana. Eastern newspapers really wanted the white portion of America to settle the West and get rid of the Indians. So newspapers fabricated stories about Indian massacres, and of course we all know about Little Bighorn. After that, the newspapers in the East were united in calling for the U.S. cavalry to clear the West of Indians. And the West was dangerous for all editors. Mobs could kill an editor with whom they disagreed. We've all seen Westerns, and we know law enforcement was not well established. And editors became kind of outrageous. The West was so dangerous, and they needed entertainment, so they often made things up. The Arizona Sentinel and the Arizona Miner got into a war of words that was just unbelievable. And you can read that for yourself. It's not often in today's newspapers that we read criticisms of another person as being quite to that extent. A Minnesota editor went after a U.S. Marshal he didn't like, and you can read that for yourself. Pretty harsh. One writer's career was made by his reporting in the West, and of course that was Mark Twain. Mark Twain was probably the kind of guy that we would like to be next to at a party. He made up tremendous stories. He imbibed in alcohol and absolutely had a wonderful time while he was a journalist, quote-unquote journalist out West. Here are a few of Mark Twain's exploits. He was sent out of town to cover a one-day story and stayed for a week. He wrote a new version of the Lord's Prayer and, obviously very strong language. And he said he was the most conceited person in the territory, already a character as he had his exploits writing out west. After the Civil War, advertising changed for newspapers. We hear a lot about brands. Now, branding is important in marketing. Well, manufacturers began to think of themselves that way. Shortly after the turn of the century, we began to have automobile manufacturing. There was the Industrial Revolution caused a lot of things to be made in factories, and manufacturers wanted a brand. Department store, more goods. Advertising agencies were set up to handle these accounts for people, and it became extremely powerful. An extremely powerful industry, and they could threaten to remove the advertising from newspapers if the newspapers did not write what they want. So newspapers had to change. They became objective. Objective doesn't mean that you can completely leave your biases out of everything, because you really can't. But you can try to tell both stories, or both sides or all sides of a story. They went after the big news. Editors became better at business, and they added special features and columns to try to attract readers to the newspapers. In the South, journalism was stifled. It took a high toll on the South to fight the Civil War, as you read about the troubles of journalists during the Civil War. Southern newspapers, in some cases, became racist, and we'll read a little bit more about the civil rights movement, journalism and the civil rights movement, as we go forward. And Reconstruction really reestablished the party press system in the South. So we began to have an age of yellow journalism. And this began with Joseph Pulitzer. And then, of course, it continued on with William Randolph Hearst. The yellow journalism wasn't called that because it was printed on yellow paper, as some people think. It was called that because there was a comic that began to appear in the pages of the newspaper. It was called The Yellow Kid, and that's why this period of journalism got this title. Selling newspapers, the most important thing in journalism. It was the beginning of investigative stories. Coverage of drinking and prostitution came back onto the front pages. Remember, in the penny press, we had a lot of that. Now it was absolutely back on the front pages again. And it wasn't the elite, it was the common man who dictated this, and that harkens back also to the penny press. Now, Pulitzer's tactics for the world, Nellie Bly went into an insane asylum and wrote stories about it. Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, he wondered if she could do it, and she wrote from every stop. He didn't like the privileged classes at all, even though he was one of the privileged classes. He knew that to reach advertisers, he had to go after the common man. And he also launched a campaign to raise money for the base of the Statue of Liberty, so he did do some good things. Then came a man, William Randolph Hearst. He had published the San Francisco Examiner, and then he bought the New York Journal, and he began to out Pulitzer. He hired the entire reporting staff away from Pulitzer, and the war was on between these two men as they tried to out-sensationalize each other. The New York market of journalism is extremely interesting in this time, because there was no end to which these two men would not go to sell newspapers. So yellow journalism was the bigger the headline, the bigger the news. Hoaxes, fake interviews, inaccuracies. News became about personalities, which we still see today. And there's always been a question, did yellow journalism cause the Spanish-American War, which, as you remember from your American history, it was a very short war. And it started kind of, historians don't really understand it, but William Randolph Hearst sent one of his reporters to Cuba, and the reporter cabled back and said, I'm wasting your money here in Cuba. There's nothing going on. And William Randolph Hearst supposedly said, stay in Cuba, you supply the pictures, and I'll supply the war. Does that mean the newspaper started the war? Well, you can join in the debate if you want to, because it's always been something that people have wondered about.